43. I believe there's more to do over here on the left. So tangent becomes sine over cosine. Cotangent becomes cosine over sine. Same thing on the bottom, but I'll have a plus sign in the middle. Sine over cosine plus cosine over sine. Complex fraction, my least common denominator looks like it's going to be sine and cosine. So sine and cosine on top, sine and cosine on the bottom. Sine and cosine times the fraction that has cosine on the bottom must the cosine cancel. I now have an additional sine. I have sine squared. Minus sine and cosine with the fraction that has sine on the bottom cancels. I have a cosine. I now have cosine squared. Going to be something similar to that on the bottom. Cosines cancel. That leaves me with a sine squared plus sines cancel. That leaves me with a cosine squared. This is going to work out really quick now. I need to show my reader, my audience, that the bottom of this fraction becomes a 1, and then I can get rid of that 1. And that was my target. (47), I'm going to work over here on the left. Secant becomes 1 over cosine. Tangent, sine over cosine. Cotangent, cosine over sine. And cosine. Your target here is tangent and secant. So you would like to have a fraction where you have a sine over a cosine, and you have another fraction with a 1 over a cosine. See if we can make all those things happen. My least common denominator between cosine, cosine, and sine will be sine and cosine. Sine and cosine with a fraction with a cosine cancels, leaves me with just the sine. Sine and cosine with the cosine on the bottom cancels the cosine, or I have a sine, now I have a sine squared. By the way, that is factorable. You can factor out a sine. You got to get rid of that plus sign, and the only way we can cancel things is we have to factor. Sine and cosine with that sine on the bottom cancels the sine, leaves me with a cosine and the other cosine, so cosine squared. And here nothing cancels, so we're going to have a sine and a cosine with the cosine will give me a cosine squared. And that is also factorable. So on top I'm going to pull out a sine. I have 1 plus sine. On the bottom I'm going to pull out a cosine squared. And that'll also leave me with 1 plus sine. Cancel the group on the bottom. Now, sine over cosine squared, you're going to tear this apart. You're going to reverse engineer. You're going to get your tangent by taking sine and putting it over cosine. And you're going to get your secant by having that as 1 over cosine. And normally we don't go in that direction, but that is legal. Sine over cosine is tangent. And 1 over cosine is secant. And that was a very nice problem. (52), working on the left-hand side, we have sine squared minus sine over cosine. And we have cosine squared minus cosine over sine. Your target is tangent squared, so we got to get rid of those minus signs, so that means we're going to end up having to factor. And tangent squared is sine squared over cosine squared. Let's see if we can get rid of some of this clutter. Your least common denominator to cancel out your complex fractions is sine and cosine. Sine and cosine times with the sine squared, nothing cancels. And we'll write that as sine cubed cosine. Minus Sine, cosine with the fraction with cosine on the bottom cancels, leaves me with a sine and the other sine, sine squared. I can factor out a sine squared. That's good for tangent squared. Sine squared cosine with the cosine squared is nothing cancels. So here's how you write that. Sine theta and cosine cubed theta. And sine cosine with a fraction with sine on the bottom cancels the sine, leaves you with a cosine and the other cosine, cosine squared. And that is factorable. We can factor out a cosine squared. So factor out a sine squared on top, leaves me with a sine, a cosine, take away a 1. On the bottom, factor out a cosine squared, leaves me with a sine. The cube for the cosine drops down to a cosine minus a 1 there. We can get rid of the groups. We have sine squared over cosine squared, and that is tangent squared. That was a very lovely little problem. '53, I'm going to work over here on the, I think I'll try the right-hand side. I'm going to make the tangent into sine over cosine. That's going to give me sine squared over cosine. I can replace the sine squared, trying to bring in a minus sign there. And know that secant is cosine on the bottom and cosine is cosine. So that sine squared has got to go. And I can replace it with 1 minus cosine squared. Something I can do with fractions like this is I can split it up and put 1 over the bottom minus the cosine squared over the bottom. You cannot do that if the top is the single and the bottom is the group, but you can do that as long as the top is the group. 1 over cosine is the same thing as secant, and cosine squared over cosine is cosine. And that was a nice little problem. 54 is similar. I think I will maybe start over here on the left-hand side. Tangent is sine on cosine. Cotangent is cosine on top of sine. Get a least common denominator, that'll be the two things. So that'll be sine and cosine. Your goal here is secant and cosecant, which is cosine on the bottom and sine on the bottom. So I have that. Cosine to the new fraction, I need to pick up a sine. I already have a sine, sine squared. Sine to the new fraction, I need to pick up a cosine. I already have a cosine, cosine squared. Sine squared, cosine squared on top is a 1. Show my audience that I can split this up into two fractions that are being multiplied together. And 1 over sine is cosecant, and 1 over cosine is secant. And that is my target. '55, let's work on the right-hand side. I can make that into 2 over cosine squared. I think I'd have more to do if I worked with the fractions over here. My least common denominator will be both of those groups. Because my target is doesn't have anything to do with sine, I think I will need to FOIL those. And that'll FOIL into something that will work really nice. On top, the first fraction, 1 minus sine to the new, I need to pick up the 1 plus sine. Or I have a 1. So I'll distribute that. Second fraction, I need to go from a 1 plus sine, I need to pick up the 1 minus sine. So with the 1, I'll do a 1 minus a sine. I'm going to distribute up on top, and I'm going to FOIL on the bottom. See how, look how my signs are going to cancel there, leave me with a 2. That 2 is nice. On the bottom, my FOIL, I end up with 1 minus sine squared. So up on top, the signs cancel, leaves me with the 1 plus the 1. On the bottom, I can replace that with cosine squared. I'm doing one thing on top, one thing on the bottom at a time. I do not want to lose my audience. 1 and 1 on top makes a 2. And 2 over a cosine squared is the same thing as 2 times a secant squared. And that was a delightful little problem. And 61, I'm going to work with the fractions. I always feel like I have more to do. Least common denominator will be a sine and a cosine. Cosine to the new, I need to pick up a sine. So I will distribute a sine with the group sine plus cosine. Sine to the bottom, I need to pick up a cosine. So I will distribute negative cosine with the group sine minus cosine. Your target is a secant and a cosecant. So we need to have a sine and a cosine on the, well, we need to have a cosine and a sine on the bottom. When we do, we need all that on top to cancel. I'm going to distribute sine squared plus sine cosine minus sine cosine plus cosine squared. Show my audience, first of all, how those middles cancel, middle two terms cancel. The sine squared and the cosine squared become a 1. I'm going to show you how this splits up into 2 fractions that are being multiplied together. And then I can replace 1 over sine with a cosecant and 1 over cosine with a secant. And that is my target.